Good morning, all. Good afternoon. Welcome to you all colleagues from international associations, all UIA associate members, and the partners and sponsors of this first session of UIA's Virtual Roundtables 2024. Thank you for joining us. We welcome participants from India, from Europe, and from many countries in Asia Pacific. My name is Clara, and I'm the External Relations Manager from the Union of International Associations, the UIA, and our headquarters is based in Brussels, Belgium. Some of you will know UIA's Associations Roundtables, which we mostly hold in person in Europe and in Asia Pacific since 2007. With these in-person events, and now additionally with our series of virtual roundtables, we address the current topics of interest for international associations. So today, Mr. Hemant Krishna from Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas, which is India's premier law firm, will speak to us about cybersecurity and privacy for nonprofits. In May, in August, and in November, we will discuss the topics corporate social responsibility, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and membership recruitment, engagement, and retention. We thank all our partners who have contributed to make this virtual roundtable possible, either with a professional contribution and expertise or with the financial support. These are Mr. Hemant Batra and Mr. Vikas Tembare, both active members of UIA and both mainly based in India, and the sponsor of this first virtual roundtable, the management of India's premier law firm, Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas and Company. Now I would hand over to our president, Mr. Cyril Ritchie, who is not only the president of the UIA, but as well the first vice president of CONGA, the Conference of NGOs in Consultative Relationship with the United Nations. Mr. Cyril Ritchie is in Geneva, and he is intending to join us today from the United Nations office at Geneva, where he's going to speak in a few minutes. And I'm not sure our president has managed to join into the session. So let me have a look and ask Vikas. Vikas, is Cyril with us?
Clara, no.
He's not there.
Yes.
Okay. So I will, you will have the opportunity to meet Cyril. Many of you may have met him already in one of our past roundtables in person in Asia Pacific or even in Europe, but you will have the opportunity to meet Cyril in May for the next roundtable. So I will now introduce our speaker of today and briefly introduce the renowned lawyer, Mr. Hemant Krishna, from Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas. I say briefly introduced because he has Hemant has an impressive list of activities and of expertise. So I will only mention some key professional stations. Hemant has a BA and a LLB from the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, and he is a partner at the top-ranked law firm Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas in the firm's technology practice group and based in Bangalore, India. Hemant has been engaged in the advisory and in the transactions field with many national and international businesses as Flipkart, Brookfield Properties, Cashel, and many more. Please ask your questions in the chat. After his presentation, Hemant Krishna will respond to your questions. Mr. Vikas Tembare will assist our speaker and either ask him your questions or open the mic for you to speak directly to Mr. Hemant Krishna. And Hemant, we now look forward to your presentation of the topic cybersecurity and privacy for nonprofits. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clara, for that kind introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'll just project my screen. Clara or Vikas, can you confirm that my screen is visible?
It is. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you right now. I'd first like to thank the good folks at UIA for having me at this conference and for the kind introduction again, Clara. It's not easy to wake up and decide that you will virtually join a webinar on cybersecurity, but you have, and here you are, and thank you for that. Since I'm a lawyer, I'm kind of duty bound to remind everyone that material that we discuss in this session is only for informational purpose and should not be construed as legal advice. Of course, I know that none of you will take legal advice as coming as part of a webinar. So for any special assistance, reach out to your attorneys. So let's get started. Now, at the cost of starting on somewhat of a morbid note, there is a quote about death from an American essayist called Roger Rosenblatt. And it says, death is something that happens to others, you think, until it happens to you. I'm afraid a cybersecurity or a privacy breach for many of us is a bit like that. So let us take a look at what our recent experience suggests. Is cybersecurity risk really so obscure? Is it imminent? What's really going on? So according to a study, an independent study conducted by an MIT professor, Dr. Stuart Madnick, which came out in December last year, the number of data breaches have tripled between 2013 and 2022. 98% organizations that have a relationship with a vendor that has experienced some form of data breach just in the 2 years between 2021 and 2022. 95% of organizations which have already experienced a breach once have ended up experiencing it more than once. That's almost 100%, repeat rate for data breaches, right? 2.6 billion personal records have been breached between 2021 again and 2022, which probably means that if you are in this room, there is actually a very high probability that your own personal data has been compromised at some point of time. So that begs a question that is broader, which is, why are privacy and cybersecurity breaches so common and so frequent? And was the internet designed to handle privacy at all in the first place, right? Now, if you dig deeper into the origins of the internet, the ARPANET, and so on, what you will end up discovering is the internet originated as a form of a network for researchers associated with universities and think tanks to collaborate, not to perform sophisticated financial transactions, not for complex communication, not for content creation, multimedia and so on. Until about 2000, in fact, the internet was predominantly what is characterized as read-only. What I mean by that is there were primarily two distinct classes of users on the internet. There were the creators and there were the users. Right? The creators created web pages with content and users use such content. Now, as a creator, you had the choice as to what information about yourself you wanted to put out there. And as a user, you did not have to share much information about yourself, barring perhaps login credentials when you were using email and so on. So there was fairly limited communication between creators and users, and almost no communication between users and users. So then came what we can call the read-write web, or the social web, perhaps, with all the social media sites, which sort of blurred the lines between creators and users, and it completely simplified the process of content creation. Today, of course, the internet is used for email and research and job search and networking, social media collaboration, entertainment, gaming, news, education, and the list just goes on, right? More importantly, it's used for payments, it's used for commerce, it's used for trading and financial transactions. All of us spend huge parts of our day connected to some internet connected device or the other, be it your smartphones, laptops, smartwatches, fitness trackers, smart cars, tablets, e-readers, speakers, headphones, of late everything from coffee machines to refrigerators, right? So all of these websites, applications, and devices are collecting data round the clock, 24/7, on the same internet that, again, let's remember, was originally conceived not to handle private data, but just collaboration for academic research. So based on some studies, on an average, we spend close to 7 hours in a day on the internet. And perhaps most of us in this room would be spending upwards of that time because, this averages out a lot of people who are not necessarily knowledge workers, so to speak. So we'll then look at how all of this is connected to non-profits, because many of you at this point may be wondering, how is all of this relevant to an organization that does not carry on an internet business? Or you could be thinking, thank goodness I'm in a non-profit, we can't possibly have much sensitive data. Well, guess what? You probably do. Let's take a look at what kind of data typically non-profits have. You have data on contributors, on philanthropists, on donors, on children, on members of marginalized communities. What are the types of data we have about these sort of persons? We have financial data, there's tax data, there's health data, there's payments data, there's political affiliation data. And these may relate to any number of domains, from education and healthcare to poverty and religion and social services, media, environment, politics, and so on. So the point I'm trying to make is not so much about the fact that cybersecurity risks are somehow unique to nonprofits, but what we can see from this list is nonprofits tend to have data about high net worth individuals, as well as the most vulnerable in the society who probably cannot afford to guard their privacy on their own. Now, this data can again be very highly sensitive. It can pertain to critical domains as well, including things like healthcare, right? So then why is it that nonprofits are targeted? Is an easy one once we've gone over, all the types of data that nonprofits typically have. It's because in addition to having this kind of sensitive data about a fairly wide range of individuals, many nonprofits are either in fact or perceived as having sensitive data, but inadequate security to guard this kind of sensitive data. There's also in a whole host of nonprofits a lack sometimes of awareness and training as to how sensitive this data is, what kind of risks typically exist in relation to data that is owned and that is processed by nonprofits, and what should be sort of the baseline cybersecurity measures that need to be put in place in order to ensure that this data doesn't get into the wrong hands. So we thought the best way to contextualize these risks and to understand what kind of consequences cybersecurity breaches and data breaches can have, it's probably best to go over a few case studies. So we'll go over 3 case studies. All of these are real-world incidents, but for the purpose of this discussion, we've decided not to take the names of the specific organizations that were at the receiving end of these attacks. We've instead decided to go by the names of a few birds. But the more persevering amongst you will probably be able to identify which of these, which bird refers to which organization because it's all in the public domain, right? Okay, so the first case study pertains to, let's call this organization Flightcatcher for the sake of this discussion. It's one of the oldest and the most prestigious international humanitarian organizations. It has played a key role in formalizing several international treaties, right? So the year was 2022. Hackers used a vulnerability in the systems of Flycatcher to gain access to its servers. They exploited, a specific vulnerability that existed in the software associated with the servers of this organization. And then they compromised the administrator credentials. They deployed offensive security tools. They disguised themselves as legitimate users who had rights to access the super sensitive information. And then they ended up encrypting the data, making it unavailable for use by legitimate members of this organization. What kind of data got compromised? Names, locations, contact information of more than, and let's hear this, 500,000 people from across the world, right? And the people who were affected included missing people, their families, detainees, other people receiving services from Flycatcher as a result of causes that it was associated with, be it, in relation to armed conflict, natural disaster relief, migration across borders, and so on, right? What were the consequences of this for Flycatcher? Flycatcher was forced to shut down its computer systems in the immediate aftermath of this attack and shut down its servers, which were connected with a large international program that it was running at that time to rehabilitate conflict-stricken families, which were spread across borders, right? This in turn impacted its ability to locate missing persons. It impacted its ability to organize relief for victims of natural disasters. And it also led to fairly huge reputational loss and erosion of trust. What is the response that it was compelled to take? It had to, like we already said, it had to take its affected servers and systems offline. Fortunately, in this case, they had a segmentation of their servers and systems, which meant that servers and systems that were handling information in relation to their other programs were not affected so much. They only had to shut down systems that were associated with this particular program. They stepped up a rollout of an internal cybersecurity enhancement program, which was already due by then. They offered to communicate directly and confidentially with hackers. And it was speculated that there were some state-sponsored hackers involved in this particular attack. But to this date, there is not much that is known about exactly who perpetrated this attack. They also made a call, very importantly, for governments and states to cooperate to protect humanitarian organizations online, just like they do offline, right? And when we tend to think of the assistance and support that non-governmental organizations need, we tend to mostly think of it in terms of financial support, government support in terms of the range of operations and visas and things like that, and policy and so on. But it's awfully important in this day and age to also ensure that that support comes in the way of technological support and security-related support. Now we move on to a second case study. Let's call this organization Macau. It's a confederation of 20 plus international NGOs focused on global poverty alleviation. They suffered a fairly brutal cybersecurity attack in 2021. The hackers used a vulnerability in Macau's system again to gain access to sensitive data. The data compromised in this case was even more sensitive. It involved names, addresses, dates of birth, email addresses, phone numbers, gender of more than 1.7 million people across the world. In some cases, even donation history and partial credit card data got exposed as part of this attack. Consequences were also very wide-ranging. The data got posted on the dark web, as it so often happens nowadays whenever there is an important breach of a database. There was huge reputational loss. As a result, Macau, of course, was compelled to notify all the affected people. They contacted their country's cybersecurity authorities. They had to make disclosures. An all-out investigation was launched into the data breach, and they had to then appoint a chief data officer and so on. And the thing that is important to notice about these kind of incidents is it's a little bit like toothpaste that's once out of the tube can't be put back, because the reputational loss, especially, and the erosion of trust of donors is something that takes a while for an organization to redeem, once it's lost as a function of an attack like this, right? Then comes another organization. This one, incidentally, is an organization who we will call Raven for the sake of this discussion. It offers cloud computing services to non-profits, corporations, educational institutions, healthcare organizations, religious organizations, and individual change agents. It was the year 2020. Hackers used security lapses in Raven's systems to gain access to its servers. Again, very sensitive information got exposed: demographic details, social security numbers, drivers' license numbers, financial records, employment data, wealth information. Because remember, this was an organization that was providing cloud services to a wide range of organizations which had identification information in relation to individuals. There was employment data, wealth information, again, donation histories, which sort of keeps coming up as a recurring theme in cybersecurity attacks that are targeted at non-governmental organizations, and health information. As it's become somewhat of a norm again, what happens is, in the aftermath of most cybersecurity attack, the hackers tend to demand a ransom, and the ransom gets demanded in the form of cryptocurrency because it allows the hackers or the perpetrators of the attack to preserve their identity and not expose it to victims of the attack or to state actors. This then got investigated by the country's top investigative agency. It was then ordered by regulatory authorities to delete all unnecessary data and boost its safeguards. It had to pay a pretty hefty amount to settle the matter with various states in its country. Right now, just imagine this quandary of an organization that has fallen victim to a cybersecurity attack. It not only has to make huge payments using funds that have probably been donated in order to carry out relief work and charitable work to perpetrators of the attack, but also potentially victims of the attack, fines to governmental authorities, and so on, which honestly comes at a very, very steep cost. And, it can throw entire budgets into disarray. It can scramble programs and goals with which those programs were framed. So what are the common forms in which cybersecurity attacks take place? There are a variety of them. Honestly, the theme of most of these attacks tend to remain somewhat the same, which is, at the end of it, data is targeted usually. Either the intention is to, limit access to data or get unauthorized access to data, and then, lock the legitimate user or organization out of access to its own data. This may take forms such as phishing and spear phishing, which is basically forms of impersonation of trusted counterparties to gain unauthorized access to steal sensitive information. Malware and ransomware, like one of the case studies that we discussed, you have attackers who encrypt information that is of a user or of an organization, and they deny access to such user, to such information, until a certain ransom is paid. Then there comes DDoS attack, also known as distributed denial of service attacks. These are where an attacker floods a server or a system of an organization with internet traffic, so much so that legitimate users are prevented from gaining access to their services and sites. Then there are attacks called MIMT attacks, or man-in-the-middle attacks, where a perpetrator positions himself in a conversation between a user and an application in order to eavesdrop or impersonate a legitimate party, and makes it appear as though it's a normal exchange of information that is underway, and in the process ends up gaining access to very sensitive information, and then there is no telling how they will misuse it. There are also these attacks called SQL injection attacks, where a hacker inserts their own code into the website or application of a particular victim organization. Then there are, of course, insider threats, which are not very technical in nature, but a current or a former employee or a vendor even can sometimes use legitimate user credentials, but misuse it to access information in a manner that is not in the interest of the organization and can cause danger to its networks, its systems, and its data, right? Then comes password attacks. Many different methods that a cyber criminal may potentially employ to maliciously authenticate, a secure account, which is password protected. There are also instances of what we call cryptojacking, where unauthorized use is done of an organization's devices, which could be computers, smartphones, tablets, and so on, by cyber criminals who want data and power and bandwidth to mine cryptocurrency. These are some of the common types of cybersecurity attacks that we see nowadays, which brings us to a very important question. And there is a lot that has been written in the recent times about whether data is the new oil, and is it the most precious asset that exists of all. And then there is a more sort of contrarian theory, and I've heard this from the famous public interest technologist, Mr. Bruce Schneier, which says and which argues that data is in fact a toxic asset. What do we mean by data being a toxic asset? Data is highly valuable. Everybody recognizes that. So everyone goes on collecting as much of it as possible. And it can very easily be used to commit fraud. It can be used to commit identity theft at scale. It's super easy to steal if it is not secured properly. It's easy for perpetrators to remain anonymous. Like we just said a short while ago, sort of the predominant mechanism through which perpetrators remain anonymous but nevertheless get paid ransom is by demanding that payments be made through cryptocurrency. Then there is no certainty about data being deleted. A lot of the time, organizations end up collecting data in relation to persons and forget all about deleting that data after the purpose for which that data was collected no longer is valid, right? So Bruce and a bunch of other people argue that because it's now cheaper to save all the data possible than to figure out what that data can be used for, data has become a toxic asset. And securing data is often the last priority of organizations that collect vast amounts of data, which makes it easier for threat actors to steal data and misuse it. But the fact is, data security is complex, but not really unachievable. So now let's come to perhaps the most critical part of this entire presentation, which is what exactly can you at your organization do in order to secure the data that is owned and that is in the possession of your organization, right? And it reminds me of a quote by Saul Bellow, which goes, "Every treasure is guarded by dragons." That's how you can tell it's valuable. Now, if the data that your organization handles is indeed valuable, it is then important to secure it. If not using dragons, by using very tangible, practical measures, right? It will allow you to realize the advantages of data without losing sleep over what might happen to it. So what are some of the common ways? And, just to assuage concerns, what I'm going to go through now will not sound too technical or complicated to any of you. This is not meant to be measures that only can be taken by your IT department. it comes down to something as simple as passwords and encryption, right? And it's 2024, so we better not continue to be using passwords like admin123 and 123456. And if we are, we better change them like yesterday. There comes another mechanism in terms of encryption, pseudonymization and anonymization. If it is no longer essential that the specific identifiable information of persons should be retained, you can pseudonymize it, you can anonymize it. There is no need to ensure that that information continues to be personally identifiable. Then you have to limit access through authentication. How do you implement access controls? You ensure that only a specific category of users who need to access that data have access to it, and not everybody in the organization, right? Have offsite backups, backup of data on remote servers, so that if you're locked out of data which is on a particular system, you have access to that same data on another alternate system, right? Ensure that you have an information security policy. There are tons of information security policy templates out on the web. There are many firms that will consult and provide you information and insight on how to frame your own information security policy. Ensure that there is training and awareness from time to time about what kind of cybersecurity attacks can happen, what are phishing attacks. It could be as simple as having that suspicion in the user's mind that it is possible that you may get an email that looks like it is from me, but it might not be from me. So please make sure that you verify the email address of the sender by default, or at least when something seems a little off with the email that you got, right? Let's say there is a particular person who typically sends emails in relation to communications of an organization. They suddenly, send out an email to people in the organization saying, please provide your credit card number for XYZ. Already, the radar should get activated in your mind that, okay, something is off with this email. Let me check the email address once again, right? Because a lot of the phishing attacks, spear phishing attacks, really happen using fairly primitive means. And all it requires is for the potential victim to have a healthy degree of skepticism when they sense that something is off. Have a disaster recovery plan to minimize interruption. It could be having data backup again, power backup, other redundancy infrastructure, computers, hardware, software, and so on. Conduct vulnerability assessments from time to time. These could be internal assessments, just like we have fire drills in our organizations, because of the buildings being sensitive. It's very similar to a fire drill. You have to have from time to time, what is the vulnerability that our systems, our applications, and our hardware stand to be exposed to, and what can we do to ensure that we address such vulnerability. Similarly, we have to have an incident response policy which tells us how to react to an incident. We should not be reinventing the wheel and trying to formulate an incident response policy when we are already in the thick of a cybersecurity attack. Because, in all likelihood, what happens is in the immediate aftermath of a cybersecurity attack, there is finger pointing, there is blame game, all sorts of things. And nobody wants to hold the baton in terms of responding to that incident. And people who are probably ill-equipped to handle and respond to that incident end up having to respond to that incident. So have an incident response policy. Last of all, but not least of all, cybersecurity insurance. Many prominent insurance vendors and companies now offer cybersecurity insurance, and they cover fairly wide range of cybersecurity incidents. And you might want to involve your IT team to negotiate it, to help you negotiate the cybersecurity insurance, but it can be a huge reassuring factor, especially if you're in the thick of a cybersecurity attack, because a lot of the cybersecurity insurance companies may not be subject to the same sort of constraints that your organization might be in terms of making payments by way of cryptocurrency, making payments to anonymous recipients, and so on. What I'm trying to argue as a result of all of this is, as you may observe again from this list, cybersecurity has more to do with process than buying products or even using cutting-edge technology. These are all measures that can be taken by any organization that has a fairly functional IT department. It doesn't require you to have, Pentagon level IT team in order to, have these measures in place. And when data and privacy are secured using measures such as these, data can be that valuable treasure. And what I'd like to argue, therefore, is data itself is not a toxic asset. It is unsecure data that is a toxic asset. With that, I'd like to conclude this talk, and I'd like to throw the floor open for any questions that you may have. I'm happy to answer questions, but just to remind listeners again, don't construe anything I say as legal advice, because this is just for general informational purposes. Thanks. Over to you, Vikas, for this.
Thank you, Hemant. Any question, guys, you have, you can put on the chat, or if you can request, raise your hand, I'll unmute you and then you can ask. Yes, there's a question. Subodh is asking, how are you ensuring companies being complained to DPDP Act?
Yeah, hi. So I think a lot of the cybersecurity measures that we discussed will also be essential in the course of ensuring compliance with the DPDP Act, because the DPDP Act, just for context, is the impending legislation in India which has actually got the president's assent, but has not yet been enforced as of now and might be enforced anytime soon. It's going to be India's first sort of comprehensive privacy-related legislative framework. On the one hand, many of the measures that we discussed are going to guard an organization against suffering a cybersecurity breach in the first place or a data breach in the first place. But compliance with any privacy framework, whether it's the GDPR or it's the DPDP Act or any privacy legislation, involves a whole host of other things. But primarily in terms of how you're taking consent, are you collecting and processing data for grounds that are legitimate? Are you limiting the purpose of its processing only to the purpose for which it has been given by its owners and users and data subjects? And, the list goes on, but we've been assisting a whole host of organizations on compliance with DPDP Act. And that discussion is going to take a long, long time.
Thank you, Hemant.
Yeah, so I see another question from Shaurya on ISO 27001. This is an international information security standard. I think whether it is really adequate to ensure cybersecurity really varies from organization to organization. As a general guideline for organizations to guard information security, I think it's a pretty good standard. But let's say there is an organization that has a lot of health data or sensitive medical data. Merely having information security standards that are compliant with the ISO 27001 standards might not in itself be adequate. So as a general guideline, I think, the 27001 guideline is of great help. But I wouldn't say that it's exhaustive, and there is always a need to customize your information security standards in light of the type and sensitivity of data that your particular organization collects. Yeah, so I see a question on cybersecurity vulnerabilities faced by tourism businesses such as hotels, airlines, tour operators. Yeah, you can look into this as well. But there have been a fairly high number of cybersecurity breaches affecting tourism operators and travel related organizations. Why is that? Because if you're, let's say, a travel aggregator or a booking company, you probably not only collect regular personal identifiable information like names and contact details and so on, but you're also accepting payments perhaps. Then there is also sensitive data about international travel and location of various persons. Where are they on a particular day? On what airline are they traveling? What is going to be their destination and so on. And if a particular person or a citizen is ordinarily at some heightened risk of facing an attack, information about these kind of things, and bear in mind that a lot of the times tourism and travel operators end up collecting data in relation to identity information in order to help people get their visas, get their passports renewed, all sorts of stuff, right? And this information can then be used to commit identity theft. It can again be, sort of auctioned off on the dark web for various, kickbacks and payments in crypto and so on. So I think in general, whether it's hotels or travel operators, I think there is a lot of sensitive personal data that gets collected, ranging from identity information to, data about travel, location, payments, all of that, which also makes it a sort of right target for any cybersecurity attack. So I think we touched upon the financial information aspects. See another question from Shubhodeep about, should a travel company based in India be compliant with the GDPR? Yes, absolutely, especially if you provide services into the European Union region, or you even deal with citizens or residents of the European Union region, because the way the GDPR is framed is it doesn't really matter whether you're incorporated in India or you're a company that is set up outside of the EU. If you're rendering services or you're dealing with data of citizens and residents of EU, you will end up becoming subject to the GDPR, and therefore it would really be advisable. And if you take some of the largest cases that have been contested and litigated in the context of GDPR, it actually pertained to companies and in most cases social media companies and so on, that were not necessarily entities that were registered or incorporated within the EU region. They may have been incorporated elsewhere, but they ended up processing the data, the personal data of residents and citizens of the EU regions in ways that were not compliant with the GDPR, and ended up attracting, huge astronomical fines as a result. And in fact, just to talk about privacy frameworks in general, even when it comes to India's own Data Protection Act, it is not so much about whether a particular company is incorporated in India or not. If there is, let's say, an organization that provides services, again, these need not be services for a particular monetary payment or with a profit motive in mind. It can even be a non-governmental organization that's providing services in the form of, relief or charitable services. Those can also qualify as service providers into the Indian region and therefore attract compliance requirements under our Data Protection Act. Okay, so thank you for all the questions. I'll wait for another minute to see if we have any more questions. If not, I will hand it over back to Vikas. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you, and hopefully, we no longer think of cybersecurity as issue that might happen to somebody else, not us, whether because we are a part of a non-governmental organization or otherwise. It is a very imminent sort of a threat and a risk. But more importantly, it's a risk and a threat that can be mitigated just by any one of us in the room to a great extent, whether we are doing it for the data that's processed by our organization or in relation to our own personal data, right? Because it is true that just because of how the internet economy functions today, the currency of the internet is the personal data. Your personal data, which is collected, whether in the form of cookies, your web history, your login credentials, your clicks on a particular e-commerce site or whatever it is. And most organizations, and this includes non-governmental organizations, everybody collects data. And because it is so cheap now to store data, and storage on a hard drive or on the cloud has become virtually free, every organization ends up collecting huge amounts of personal data. And what's important to understand when we are collecting this data is it has probably been provided by a person for a specific purpose. And it is, an obligation on the organization processing it or collecting it to ensure that it is only used for that specific purpose and not for just about anything. If I'm providing my personal data in order to make a particular payment, I'm not offering my data in order for targeted advertising to be, shown to me. If I'm, providing my data for, let's say, filling out a booking form for a travel operator, I am not then allowing or consenting for that travel operator to hand over my data to an organization that does e-commerce in, cosmetics. And the list goes on. A lot of the time, the kind of data that is a travel company is interested in might be very similar to, the kind of data that an e-commerce company is interested in. That does not mean that by parting with my data to organization X, I have also consented to that data being used and shared with organization Y and Z and so on. So some of the key hallmarks of the data protection world, and moving slightly away from cybersecurity, but again, they are sort of joined at the hips for most part, is to ensure purpose limitation, minimization in how you collect data and how much data you collect, and ensuring that it's really only used for purposes that are consented to. And in fact, now there is an entire debate raging through Europe and other parts of the world about whether consent itself is a valid ground for processing. Because a lot of the time, a particular user might just want a service because somebody else who has the ability to pay for it has access to that service. So as a result, they may have consented to use of their data in a wide variety of ways without fully understanding the consequences and repercussions of it. So there is also a debate about whether consent itself is sufficient for all practical purposes, or, organizations should be prohibited from even collecting consent for use of data that is not related to the primary purpose or service that they provide. So it's a very interesting set of debates around cybersecurity and data, and hope all of you had something to walk away with from this webinar that's going to come in handy. With that, I'd like to hand it back to Vikas. Thanks again, Clara, Vikas, John, for joining. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hemant. This has been a very impressive and detailed presentation. You have created or increased the awareness amongst the nonprofits and amongst the meetings industry, yes, about all, first, about all the data we have, maybe without realizing how important and how delicate this data is. And second, yes, you have helped to identifying the risks. And thus, this is a first step into, into helping and into finding solutions in order to protect our organizations from cyber attacks, from data mining, and to handle the data with care. And thank you for offering your advice. I would like to thank you all very much for joining UIA's first virtual roundtable. And especially, I would like to thank our partners who have contributed to make this roundtable possible. UIA active members, Vikas Tambare, and as well Hemant Batra, who is a partner as well from Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas. And we thank this law firm for their support of the non-governmental associations and nonprofits based in India and Asia Pacific. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you all again for the next virtual roundtable taking place on the 7th of May, where we will present a case study and discuss the topic of corporate social responsibility. And now, wherever you are, have a nice day, a nice afternoon, a nice evening. Thank you all.